Right. Well, welcome everybody to this meeting organised by the Socialist History Society. And Hugh, Brody and Merilyn Moos will discuss how the experiences of imperialism and exile from Nazism generate and rely on silences in both personal and political realms. Hugh is a writer, anthropologist and filmmaker. His books include The People's Land, Maps and Dreams, and The Other Side of Eden. For 30 years, he has worked with and for Indigenous people of the Canadian North, developing land claim research and in support of land rights and cultural survival projects, which has led to a number of documentary films. He is also an honorary professor of anthropology at the University of Kent in Canterbury. And his most recent books, his most recent book is Landscapes of Silence: From Childhood to the Arctic, published this year. Merilyn is a member of the committee of the Socialist History Society, and she's been author of several books on the relationship between silence and exile. For instance, Breaking the Silence here. I've worked with Merilyn on a couple of publications, one called Anti-Nazi Germans and the other published by the Socialist History Society on Strike Against the Nazis, both of which deal with one of the other great silences in bourgeois historiography, that of class and the class struggle. So the format tonight's meeting will take will be Merilyn will speak for about 10 minutes. Then Hugh will speak after that. Then Merilyn will ask Hugh a question, which he will answer, and then he will ask her a question. After which it'll be a free-for-all for the audience to ask whatever questions they please, and then there'll be a final conclusion. From summing up from both of the speakers, while preparing for this meeting, I was struck by another similarity between the two topics, is between imperialism and fascism. And a quote from Reginald Sorensen from the Labour Party conference of 1933. The operation of imperialism in India is, in essence, no different from the operation of fascism in Germany. On that basis, can I ask Merilyn to start, plean? Merilyn.
No, that's Steve. We can go back to that. We can go back to that later in the discussion. I'm going to start off by talking about the silence I was brought up in, and as ever, this bit I am going to essentially read. Other people from the second generation will be familiar with the sort of silences that we were brought up in. My parents fled almost immediately after the Reichstag fire in early 1933, primarily because my father had been an active anti-Nazi. That much I did know as a child, though even then, it was in terms of my father's role in agitprop theatre, no mention of political activism. What I didn't know was why I had virtually no family. As I grew older and tentatively asked about what had happened to my parents' relatives, I was met with fury or silence or lies. So I was brought up in a family which was imbued with German cultural patterns, but knowing nothing of my German past. We ate pumpernickel and sauerkraut, which in 1950s Durham in the northeast of England where we lived was unheard of. We ate our meals with beautiful old German silver. The grandfather clock, which I now have in my room, ticked a German talk. And my parents' awareness of European political and literary ideas would put any of us today to shame. My first children's books, including the awful Max and Moritz, were in German. So here was a quandary. I was surrounded by a German Kultur, but knew nothing of my German past. Why did my parents want to silence the past? The reasons are various, and this and their relative significance, it's tentative. Firstly, I suspect my parents found remembering their murdered family, comrades and friends unbearable. They had lost contact with their roots, lived in a foreign country, spoke a foreign language, which, however familiar, still did not roll off the tongue as their native language once had. They had lost all that was familiar to them, such as weather, local landscape, the schools they'd been to, friends. They arrived in Britain with almost nothing, apart from the knapsacks on their backs and a few shillings. More than anything else, many of their relatives had been murdered. In my mother's case, she knew of the death of her sister, Anna Marie, though of course the Nazis made out it was due to natural causes when she was in fact gassed. But she believed her father still to be alive. She searched for him for a couple of years at the end of the war, only to discover that he wasn't alive after all. I was 2 when the fateful Red Cross letter arrived. The past became something best forgotten, unspeakable. The only time I observed my parents close to tears was when we stood around the Christmas tree, its wax candles burning, and we sang O Tannenbaum, Wie grün sind deine Blätter. Seeing my parents so distressed, I was terrified. But their silence was also because they wanted me to belong, to be assimilated in England, not to be burdened by a murderous past. I strongly suspect that if ever they had explained why they refused to speak of the past, that's how they would have couched it. They'd have said they wanted to protect their daughter. There is one particular silence which many find especially problematic. Their relatives had been murdered as Jews, but there was nothing evidently Jewish about my upbringing. It was not just that we frequently ate bacon and pork sausages, and we never celebrated any of the Jewish festivities. If the issue of Jewishness ever came up, my parents made clear that the leaders of the Jewish community were not generally anti-Nazi, which is not at all the same as saying no anti-Nazis were Jews. And I know this is difficult territory, and it still creates much heat, including in today's Labour Party. But I mean, the long and the short of it is that I had no idea I was historically Jewish. When I asked about what had happened to different members of my unknown family, my mother lied, something she was adept at. I suspect if I'd asked my father about anti-Semitism, he would have assured me that it was the struggle for socialism that mattered, as under socialism, racism would dwindle and disappear, a view I do understand. Everybody now knows about the Holocaust, but that was not the case when I was growing up in the late 1940s and 50s. A combination of the Allies wanting to work with ex-Nazis in West Germany and the icy grip of the Cold War left the Nazis' systematized murder largely unspoken of. My parents' experiences, had they talked of them, would have not been met with understanding, never mind sympathy. Better to protect their daughter and themselves and not speak of the past. But this left me without a past, with no knowledge of having had a family or what had happened to them. It's a vacuum which left a deep sense of unreality and insecurity. My parents had fled for political reasons. My father's anti-Nazi activities or his membership of the Communist Party were never mentioned, indeed denied. My father had been active in a number of committed anti-Nazi organizations associated with the German Communist Party. Of course, I didn't know any of this until late middle age. I was convinced he was an ardent anti-Stalinist. As I write in my memoir, and if you want to buy it, I have fears from Amazon. My mother, father, and I celebrated the death of Stalin when, most unusually, my father pulled out a dusty bottle of German wine, and the three of us, I was then aged 8, toasted Stalin's death. I was astonished to discover in the National Archives in Kew when I was in my 60s that not only had my father been a member of the Communist Party in Germany, he became the leading comrade of the exile group in London. The British government, as many of us know, was far from welcoming towards refugees from Nazism, especially before Kristallnacht, and especially if political. Such refugees were threatened that if they indulged in political activity, they could be returned to Germany, as indeed some were. And so my father's shutting out of the murderous past was reinforced, I suspect, by their subsequent experiences in Britain. So when I was young, my parents were always afraid. I mean, I would actually say paranoid. They believed they were always being watched and covered the phone with cushions so the Secret Service couldn't hear what they were saying. They also locked the front door with 5 locks. I mean, it was a fortress. And I absorbed fear as a child in bucketfuls and have never totally freed myself from walking in its shadow. So to conclude, the history of left resistance to the Nazis is still largely written out of history, although Steve and I have tried very hard to put it back in. Anyway, yet the Nazis' attempt to destroy the left's ideas were not successful. Although my parents attempted to insist I didn't dabble in left-wing politics, so great was their fear of what could happen to me, I also absorbed from them, miraculously, a sense of rebelliousness. I first turned this against them, very much so, but was then to go on to become an activist for about 20 years, a member of IS and SWP, and a lifelong anti-racist. I grew up proud of my parents for risking their lives to resist Nazism, and I'm proud to follow in their footsteps. Thank you.
Thank you, Merilyn. That was wonderful. Thank you. Like Merilyn, I grew up in a home filled with silence. My mother was a refugee from Vienna. Her mother lived with us, who was also a refugee. Most of the family had been murdered. And the murder that lived behind us, that had shaped us, was not spoken about. We lived in a silence that was private. And I came to realize later that I also lived in a silence that was public. I did history at school up to what was then called AS level, about as high as you could go. And I never had a history lesson that addressed the Holocaust, the Nazis, or anything to do with the events that had in fact shaped Britain, never mind me. So there were 2 levels of silence that I lived with, the silence at home and the public silence. But I want to speak not about my family. I want to make a leap, the leap that I made by way of an escape from all those silences in anti-bourgeois north of England to the high Arctic. In 1970, I found myself living in a community of 500 Inuit at the northern tip of Baffin Island. And when I first arrived there, I was unnerved and uneasy. Even though it was only 1970, I was already uncomfortable by being a strange white man who appeared in the middle of other people's world. And I was concerned to establish some kind of first round of relationships with the people of this community where I was living. And I discovered that there was a tiny little community radio station in this village. And I had the idea of asking somebody to make an announcement on the radio station that this strange white man who had arrived, the kind of person that the Inuit called a Khadlunak, a person from the south, this strange Khadlunak had arrived and would like to meet people, and he would be very interested in talking to anybody who wanted to talk to him about their experience of Khadlunak. So I wanted to set up interviews that people could volunteer for about the subject that was my type of person as opposed to their type of person. This was my attempt to make anthropology somehow less troubled by its methodological habits than usual. And to my amazement, almost every single household in the community very quickly said they wanted me to come and visit them. So I went to, I would say, between 70 and 80% of all the households in this community over the following few weeks, and listened to people talk about the history of their relationship with Khadlunat. That is to say, with traders, missionaries, policemen, and government officials. And I sat hour upon hour as people poured out their stories of abuse of their land, abuse of their belief systems, abuse of their language, abuse of their very minds, or they wouldn't have put it that way, and in all too many cases, abuse of their bodies as well. And what I was in fact receiving was an outpouring of pain and grief and to some extent trauma from people who were in age between 40 and 70, the older members of the community, men and women alike. And in just about every house, the people told me they had never spoken about this before. In effect, they were breaking their silence. And by breaking their silence, they were revealing the nature and the depth of the silence that they had endured. In some cases, all their lives, in some cases, just the last 10 to 20 years of their lives, depending on when they came to live in these government-controlled circumstances. And as they talked about the Khadlunat, I kept noticing they used one particular word, the word is ilha. And I puzzled about this word. Again and again, people said they felt ilha. They were in a condition of ilha. They were overwhelmed by ilha. And I learned over the years of studying the language that ilha means the kind of fear that people have of ghosts, the kind of fear they have of forces over which they have no control, which they can't escape. Its closest translation perhaps would be existential intimidation. This was what the Khadlunat, this is what the Southerners did to them. And this gave me a window, I think, onto what imperialism does by way of oppressing and silencing by oppressing. And it's a reminder, I suppose, that imperialism is not the same everywhere in the world. There are many kinds of imperialism and many stages of imperialism. The sort of imperialism I was encountering in northern Canada and subsequently in Australia and other parts of North America was what may be known as settler colonialism, an imperialism which is a seizing of the land. Imperialism that I met with when working in India is completely different. It doesn't attempt to seize the land, simply it seizes the entire population. And perhaps a crude way of distinguishing between the two poles of imperialism, perhaps, is to look at the extent to which they do or don't want the human beings they encounter. The imperialism in Australia wants rid of the entire Aboriginal population, as did the imperialism in Southern Africa. Imperialism in India wanted the population to be there working for them and to be exploited by them. But all these imperialisms have one thing in common, of course, which is a theory of those they are imperializing, a theory which insists that they are not quite human. They're inferior or primitive or simple or barbaric or something which makes them at a significantly lower level of development of humanity. And that this ideology, this construction of the human makes it possible to disregard them, to kill them, to overwhelm them, to colonize them, to do whatever the imperialists think is in the imperialist interests. And the Inuit that I spent my time listening to, just like the people I met subsequently in the Kalahari and Aboriginal people I spoke to in Australia, all knew very well how they had been constructed, how they were the subjects of an ideological model, how they had been consigned to inferiority and consigned to various kinds of abuse, the abuse of their land, the abuse of their lives, the abuse of their minds and the abuse of their bodies. And every part of this abuse has been accompanied in the imperialist context where I've worked by the deepest of silences. Silences that lasted, in some cases, generations, as was the case, of course, with the boarding school programs in Canada and Australia and the United States. Silences that were not broken by the people who suffered the grief and the trauma and the losses, were not recorded by the nation states that created these losses. So I think that's probably all that I want to say for now. And I'll hand it back to Merilyn.
Okay. Okay, the format, I'm now going to ask you, Hugh, a question, which we have discussed, which is, what do you see as the similarities, which you've already touched on, the similarities between the silences which are associated with imperialism and Nazism?
Well, as you have said, as I have said, we both experienced silences that came from the Nazis through our experiences at home. We lived in homes, or I lived in a home, where the horror was so great, it had to be kept out. And to keep out the horror was to insist upon silence as best they could. And as you said, this was in part to protect the children and to achieve the assimilationist project. Englishness was what mattered to my parents, not the history of the Second World War. Life was what they embraced. They had children as a way of refuting, I suppose, the terrible accumulation of death that lay just behind us. But I think I would like to talk a bit about the kind of silences that surrounded the boarding school programs that I just alluded to. For over 100 years in Canada and the United States, the government had the established policy of taking children away from their homes, often as young as 4, 5 or 6 years old, and putting them into boarding schools, residential homes really, for the whole of the year from the end of August to following June. And at these homes, they were not allowed to speak their language, were forced to wear the clothes of the South, and the project was to separate them completely from their heritage. The idea was that after 5 or 6 years in one of these schools, the children, now turned into young adults, would be able to take their place somewhere on the frontier class ladder if they did not want to move into a city and take their place in an urban class ladder as workers in factories, on farms, as domestic servants. This was an attempt to transform entire peoples. It was not in its formation a genocidal project, it was a culturecidal project, but it came to be genocidal because these schools did not only abuse the rights of the children, they abused them as human beings. They were physically abusive, and they were on an enormous scale sexually abusive. Huge numbers of these children endured the most awful sexual predation on the part of priests, clergymen, nuns, teachers of various kinds. This went on generation after generation. I knew people who were third generation victims of this system. And this relates to silence because it revealed how completely disappeared that kind of extreme history, that extreme suffering from imperialism can be. Nobody spoke about what happened at those schools. I went to work for the Canadian government in the 1970s. I had a middle-level bureaucratic position. I worked with colleagues who were in the Department of Education. Nobody ever spoke to me about these schools. I spent time living with the First Nation people on Skid Row in Edmonton, visited reserves, had many, many interviews with people at that time, late 60s, early 70s. Nobody ever mentioned the schools. the silence was absolutely extraordinary. It was silence that I was later to learn that lay deep within people, that many of those who had survived the experience of these schools were, I think the right word is, so traumatized that they could not bring themselves to speak about it. Like many victims of sexual abuse, child sexual abuse, they felt ashamed, guilty, muted. So this silence was deeply within the whole Indigenous world of Canada and the United States and many parts of Australia and other countries, I have to say. And the silence that surrounded it was also institutional in the sense that the Canadian government would not break this silence. And it was only when the horrifying discovery of bodies took place a few years ago, which I'm sure many of you will have read about in the newspapers, when buried children were found to be in communal graves, as well as some individual graves all around these residential schools, that finally the story broke and the reality started to be spoken of, and the Canadian government made its apologies and seeks to make restitution. But this revealed the extent to which imperialism causes, and perhaps to some extent relies on, an extraordinary profound silence, a silence that is deeper than a matter of history. It's a silence that's as deep as the psyche can achieve silence. And I think this reminds us that imperialism is a truly, truly terrible phenomenon. And that brings me to the question that I'd like to ask Merilyn, which is, how do you see the connection between Nazism and imperialism in this context?
I mean, I think the first thing to say is there isn't an answer to that, and that there will be many different interpretations. But I mean, one of the things that struck me when we were discussing this and when I was reading about it is that, in a way, people have forgotten how similar Nazism, fascism was in its form to forms of imperialism. And you know, Steve began this meeting with a very interesting reference. But, you know, actually, if one goes back to looking at the attitudes of people in the quote colonies, such as in India, there was a lot of ambivalence as to, you know, whether actually one should support Britain in its fight against Nazism, against fascism. Anyway, I mean, that's something which we can discuss later. But I mean, I first want to talk about similarities and then dissimilarities. I mean, there are obviously some similarities. I mean, as you've just brought out, Hugh, very well. I mean, both imperialist forms and Nazism acted to shut down the narratives of their subjects. That's one. I mean, and if you look actually at the Nazi state, of course, it had its roots in imperialist Germany. You know, I mean, Germany had the First World War was in part a consequence of Germany's feeling thwarted in not being able to build up as many colonial possessions as, for example, Britain had. So that, you know, the Nazism wanted to claim and reclaim its colonies. I mean, that was one of its driving forces. Why should Britain have colonies and Germany didn't? So that's one sort of similarity. But I mean, another similarity is the ideological similarity. I mean, Nazism can be seen as a particularly aggressive form of imperialism. But it was building on ideological formations which had been developed in Europe and in America. I mean, it was building on a social Darwinist view of some people as being inferior to other people. And, you know, it colonized the East. It defined the Slavs as being Untermensch, so that, you know, it was an extreme development of an imperialist mode. But there are differences, you know, and I mean, I get quite uneasy disentangling all this, but one difference, and this is important in terms of our subject of silence, is that Nazism actually only lasted 12 years. I mean, it may have in effect traumatized you and me and other members of the second generation, but I mean, colonialism, imperialism has lasted, depending on which society you're looking at, for hundreds of years, and therefore the impact on memory and the impact on the ability to continue with the political and cultural formats will be different. So that's one thing. Another thing is that the Nazis actually, they as I have argued, and Steve and I have argued elsewhere, is their first purpose was to smash the workers' organizations. You know, if one looks at those early years, who were they arresting? They were arresting the communists once, and trade union activists. Once they had cleared the ground, they were then able to move on to colonize others. So, you know, when one's looking at genocide, which is what happens a few years later on, but they're actually practicing genocide against initially their own people. I mean, there may be people who they define as being inferiors, but that is very different from an imperialist format where it is always control of others. I mean, another a similarity is that the Nazis were really out to get, when they moved east, they were pursuing oil, they were pursuing raw materials. They may have called it Lebensraum, but in that sense, they actually, you know, they wore the clothes of the classic imperialists. I don't understand genocide. If one looks at the Nazi genocide, I would say it takes on an extremity which doesn't characterize most imperialist modes, because the state goes in for systematic killing. And it, you know, it kills in camps and by gas. This isn't just military skirmishes. This isn't just the Einsatzgruppe. So that Nazism, I think, develops a form of genocide which does distinguish it from other forms of imperialism, because it was so systematized by the state. But I know that a lot of people may not agree with me. I just want to end really by mentioning resistance, although I'm hoping we'll talk about that in discussion as well, because the Nazis crushed all resistance. I mean, they murdered any form of resistance, but they weren't able to kill off their ideas. And because Germany and Austria, etc., were industrialized, they were urban countries where there was a possibility for organization in a way which may not always occur in agricultural countries where the population is dispersed. In some ways, well, shut up and hope people ask questions.
Thank you, Merilyn. We missed the last two sentences. You froze. Do you wish to repeat?
You have suddenly disappeared, which is rather scary.
No, we can see you. Don't worry.
Sorry?
We can see you.
I can't see you. You vanished.
Don't worry about whether you can see us. We can see you and we can hear you. So.
Okay. Basically, the last couple of sentences were just me saying that although the Nazis were able to silence people during their 12 years of vicious control, I mean, that because it was an industrialized, centralized society where there were, there was a working class organization, etc., the ideas were not destroyed by the Nazis. That's roughly what I said.
Well,
Are you still there?
Thank you both very much. That was excellent. Now, I'm going to throw it open to questions. Can you please raise your hand using the reactions button at the bottom of your screen? Do I see anyone wishing to ask a question, make a statement, disagree? Anything of the sort? Well,
Steve, if no one wants to say anything, I would like to. I could just respond very briefly to something Merilyn said about the mass murder being on. I'm not sure whether Merilyn is saying it's off the spectrum or at the far end of the spectrum of murder. But I think if you look at the history of Australian Aborigines or the history of the Bushmen in Southern Africa, or the German operations in Southwest Africa, or the clearing of the entire Middle America of its Native Americans, these are on a very similar scale and may not be industrialized or bureaucratized, but they were certainly systemic matters of national policy and implemented with extreme ruthlessness.
Thank you. Yes, right. I have two hands up. Naboxa.
Could people introduce themselves, because I can't see?
Right, they will introduce themselves. There's Naboska, whose name I probably mispronounced, and he will tell me how to pronounce it properly, and Richard Kirkwood. So first, Naboska.
Thank you, Nebojša. It's Nebojša. I'm from Belgrade, Serbia, former Yugoslavia. So socialist country, socialist upbringing. I'm very grateful to your organization and also to Merilyn for organizing and offering opportunity to discuss these very important topics, which are simply, it's not only, I just want to discuss about the origin of silence. Silence is there because there is no solution for the consequences. And everybody knows that. If you maybe followed the latest meeting of CELAC, Latin American and Central American Economic Community and European Union, for the first time, the issue of reparations was initiated by the Latin American for reparations for millions of victims of colonization, slave trade, imperialism in short, in a nutshell. So European representatives denied because they simply cannot open. There is no narrative to cope with that. How to open that issue? Because, and then what Latin American countries said, okay, we just recognize, and in a common proceedings, there was like some sort, we apologize for millions of victims, we apologize. But what Central American and Latin American countries asked, let's stop using the benefits from imperial plundering crime in today's trade relations between European Union and Latin and Central American countries. So the problem is the heritage, not only in moral and ethical questions, which are also there to cope with, but also with economic advantage that imperialist economies and countries, and I'm sorry, most of the inhabitants simply inherited without being asked, do they want, or, and I think that Marx called it imperial rent. So every, let's say, better off citizen of imperial economies charges imperial rent still today, from the past and from the actual economic world system relations. So this is the origin of silence, because there's no idea how to cope with this. And why there's no idea how to cope with this is because the theory of world system, which originates from Marxist analysis of relations in 19th century Europe and its colonies, it's just demonized, it's erased, it's abandoned. So you cannot explain how it developed. And recently one Indian scientist, female, I can post in the chat the interview with her on Breakthrough News. She researched the main source of plunder of India in 19th century. It was not just goods and services and like using India market. It was tax. Everybody was taxed, and these taxes, these incredible profits, were then invested in the industrial growth of US, which had free slave labor. So this is the origin of development and cultural, to say, hegemony of these imperialist centers, and how you can cope with it. And she said, even in Marxism, there are no concepts to understand the dimensions and quality and quantity of that plunder. So we have to open that issues on theoretical field and to think how to overcome this. This is not silence. This is structural blindness that is, in fact, being reproduced in our everyday lives. I don't pay. Okay, I'm at the semi-periphery. But for example, historical Serbian bourgeois elites were also imperialism curious. You know, like they were trying to operate on that level in the surroundings, especially towards Albania, etc. So it's like it's the mechanism built in the system, the attempt to produce alternative in Soviet Union, later in China. Okay, now it's not unsuccessful anymore. But you know, like if we don't have concepts to understand the scope and nature of that process historically, we are lost. We are lost ethically. We are lost economically, and because of that fear of that loss, we keep silent.
Thank you very much. Does either Merilyn or Hugh want to respond to that?
No.
In which case, Richard. You will need to unsilence yourself. Richard, you're silent at the minute, I'm afraid. I know that fits in with what we're talking about, but can you yet speak? No, you've frozen now.
Hello.
I
had a technical problem there. Can you hear me now?
We can continue.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, I wanted to come back to the points that both Merilyn and Hugh were making about the silences among individuals and communities who are, you know, the victims, although I never liked that word, of these colonial and, you know, racist and so on attacks. Because I think one of the things that really affected people, and this is what I get from both from Merilyn and from Hugh, is that they are made to be foreigners in their own space. That people, you know, Jewish Germans, Jewish Poles, Polish Poles even, and indigenous peoples in, you know, the New World, Australia and so on, are made to become outsiders in their own world.
Yeah, I think you've frozen, Richard, but anyway, you've stopped. Thank you very much, Hugh.
Yeah, look, a very, very brilliant point, Richard. Thank you. It's the condition of indigenous peoples around the world to be made to feel foreigners in their own lands, and they are told implicitly or explicitly that their lands are not theirs anyway. Their way of knowing the land is not the right way to know the land, that the real gods are not in their lands at all, but are in some church that is plonked on their lands and run by people from outside. So the way in which colonialism renders people dispossessed and alienated is a crucial part of the process, and it goes along with all kinds of silences, of course. It did occur to me as Richard was talking whether you could say the same thing happened to huge parts of the English working class. They were made to feel they were strangers in their own land, and especially the rural poor. As industrialization developed in the countryside, the rural poor were made to feel that they did not belong in their own countryside. In fact, it was not their countryside at all. So I suspect there could be a class analysis as well as an imperialist analysis of this, of Richard's point.
Yes.
Merilyn, do you want to say anything?
Yes. It's very difficult not being able to see, but I agree with Richard and Hugh.
Good, thank you. Nebojsa mentioned the question of reparations, and something I've been involved with, the question of reparations for enslavement. And I mean, part of the reason, it seems to me, that they that the government require silence on the issue is because it would cost them an awful lot of money to meet the claims. But and I think, you know, that there is this, they have carefully constructed a whole kind of ideology of great people. I mean, statues to ruthless businessmen who enslaved and murdered and abused people the world over, who then gave a couple of quid to charity and get a statue. And when we demand that these statues be removed or replaced with something else, they go absolutely mad. And so there is this, to me, it seems, this question of the construction of silence deliberately to kind of as part of bourgeois ideology. Do you want to say anything about that, Merilyn? Or?
Well, you've just taken my conclusion. I mean, I mean that I think is, if you like, what our title didn't encompass, which is the way in which issues to do with imperialism, and actually I would say many issues to do with Nazism, are either marginalized or not addressed, of which, you know, I mean, if you think about the way in which the demonstrators who pulled down the Coulson statue were prosecuted, and as you've just said, you know, the failure to take the issue of reparations seriously, the marginalization and persecution of the children and people who came over from the Caribbean in the 50s and 60s. But I mean, I think that silencing actually also, just to continue, also actually does apply to Nazism, because I think the discourse over Nazism has become very much to do with the mass murder of the Jews, and class has again been effectively written out of the kind of dominant agenda, so that the fact that the Nazi system actually was originally was originally aimed at the destruction of the working class, and that is one of the main reasons why sections of the German ruling class supported it. I mean, you know, that isn't talked about, and yet I mean I think it's very relevant to, you know, shine light on both these issues, because, you know, when one's looking for what is happening in modern Europe now, I mean, one doesn't just want to look at issues to do with genocide. One actually wants to look at, you know, the crushing of working class organizations. I'm sorry if I'm being a bit incoherent, but I'm speaking to a blank screen, which is quite difficult.
Hugh?
Can I say a word about reparations? I mean, they're a big part of the Canadian project. And as the story of the boarding schools has come to light, and the scale of the violence that was done to those children, to those heritages, has been documented, the successive Canadian governments have agreed that there has to be some form of atonement, and therefore huge public apologies, and also that there should be reparations, and victims of the boarding school program can apply for a cash payment that is measured by how many years they spent in one of those schools. So it's an attempt to actually sort of pay back, compensate people for the violence they suffered in the schools. And of course, that's perhaps a very good thing, and there are many, many arguments that are made about the pros and cons of this. But of course, what it leaves out is what the imperialism has fundamentally done, which is to take people's land from them. So the proper reparation is to give people back their land, to give them back their homes, to identify the ancestral homelands and say, okay, these are yours. That would be reparation. But of course, it's economically and politically unimaginable that somebody would say, well, actually, here's Vancouver. Vancouver, it was owned and occupied by 3 or 4 quite distinct cultures. Here it is, we're giving it back to you. And no one knows quite what to do with reparations. On the one hand, there's a commitment to make good the damage that's been done, and paying out money and making apologies is feasible, but actually making restitution is not feasible, except in marginal cases. So I think as soon as a nation state commits to reparations, it puts itself in an incredibly problematic position. I also want to say something very quickly about the Truth and Reconciliation. Of course, we know from the South African experience a very major attempt to create a form of reparation and reconciliation, a reordering of the story, an acknowledgement of the narrative, a breaking of the silence. A similar thing was set up a few years ago in Canada, a national truth and reconciliation process to deal with the abuse of children in the schools. But the process was designed so that the only people who spoke at it were the victims, the abused. So none of the abusers spoke. So there was no reckoning, no calling to account. And therefore, as a process, it became a sort of institutional confessional. Well, a breaking of silence is no bad thing, perhaps. When people are just pouring out their pain, what they do is reinforce their victimhood, put it that way. And they are not confronting the perpetrators who needed to be giving evidence as well. We needed to hear from the school teachers and the priests and the government officials who committed these crimes, or who enabled them, or who passed the legislation to make it not a crime, but a normality. So I think reparations are, as a matter of practice, very, very complex and perhaps theoretically unachievable.
Right. Is there anyone else who wishes to ask a question, make a statement? Richard, again, let's hope your technical problems are over. But you do have to unsilence yourself.
Unmute.
Yes.
Yes. No, just to really add to that, which brings us when Hugh says it's not possible, the thing is, it is not possible in a world which continues to be dominated by imperialist capitalism. That's the problem. And every thing of this sort brings us back to the power of capital. And I think that's the issue that runs behind it. You know, capital does not want these issues to be thought about, because ordinary working people in capitalist societies, if they really understand what's going on, will not be very happy with it. And capital knows that. I mean, capital has a sort of weird collective memory, rather the way that Labour bureaucrats have when it comes to dealing with Jeremy Corbyn. There are things that are not on the agenda. And as long as capital is able to keep that off the agenda. So, we do have to go back and be terribly old-fashioned and talk about confronting capital.
Right. Thank you, Richard.
Thank you, Richard. But can I just make a comment to that? Yes, I agree with that, Richard. And I don't think I said it was impossible. I said it was problematic. And I'm very reluctant to take the view that there not be some reconstitution of society in which there is a just settlement of the claims and demands of those who have been imperialized. And in fact, the land claims movements in many of the settler colonial worlds are very important examples of a fight back that does have a prospect of achieving something. What it will not achieve, of course, on its own is a class-based revolution or a reordering of the ownership of means of production, but it can include a serious redistribution of land and rights within and to land. So I don't want to be really defeatist here.
Can I say, if I may make a comment here, sometimes it's a bit like talking of climate change. It seems, of reparations seems such a vast problem that God knows how we could solve it. So we kind of give up. Whereas I think if we start to look at some of these sort of smaller issues that are kind of more approachable. So in terms of the indigenous, the First Nations people of Canada and the Native Americans, I mean, supporting the fight against the tar sands, supporting the fight against the Dakota Access Pipeline and so on, will not bring justice, but it will bring a reduction of injustice, if you see what I mean, which is a step in the right direction. But actually, I'm abusing the chair here. I noticed that Andrew Bolton wants to say something. So, Andrew.
I came because I've been haunted by this sentence from Paulo Freire: to be silenced is to be oppressed, in the pedagogy of the oppressed. So I've not been disappointed by your presentations. Thank you very much. All the discussion has been very illuminating. So how do we break the silence? I mean, Hugh started to break the silence by listening, but how do we systematically break the silence?
Can I say something?
Merilyn, your turn, yes.
I mean, I think it partly depends on whose silence you're referring to. But, I mean, I approach this as a socialist or as a revolutionary. And so when it comes to Nazism, I want to break the silence by giving voice to the people whom the Nazis deprived of a voice, but in particular the anti-Nazis. And I mean, I think that's, although I can't see, which means I can't read people's expression, but I think in a way that's also what Steve was alluding to, that one actually has to support what struggles there are against the powers who are trying to, take away the earth or reclaim whatever can be reclaimed in terms of indigenous peoples. I hope that makes some sense.
Right, I think we've worked the pair of them hard enough. I'm going to allow one more speaker Nebojsa, you can speak, and then thereafter we will have a summing up from Hugh and Merilyn.
Thank you. I just wanted to mention one problem in expectation of oppressed and subjugated peoples and cultures to respond, to really successfully resist. I suppose you all know better than me the character of Caliban from Shakespeare's Tempest. I will post here. It's a book by one Afro-Caribbean professor, Caliban's Reason. Why this terrible character, that how it is presented in Tempest, this rotten, envious, mean, evil person, is in fact justified in understanding in overall world condition why he hates his master, why he also envies him. I mean, this is so good explanation of the problem that we have. And just the point is that this professor, in one recent discussion at the Brecht's Forum, now it's Marxist Educational Project in New York, said that what we need is working class institute of technology, because that institute could calculate the problems of reparation, the problems of equalization of actual huge differences in a world system where, you know, in Niger, 80% of people do not have electricity, and every third bulb in France is powered by uranium from Niger. You know, this is the illustration of the world system. And let's be honest, we don't know how to address it. Why? Because all the intellectual capacity is in this or another way submerged to interest of capital. And working class Institute of Technology is this like address that we could invest our hope to, because we don't know, we are integrated in this bourgeois. I work in Culture Center. We are all integrated in this bourgeois, cultural hegemony. And we really cannot think of that. And this is our problem. Why we cannot think? You know, I think in the end that the fear and paranoia about artificial intelligence is in fact the symptom of that fear, that there is still intelligence that can think about all that out of our control and out of our, control mechanism and power structure. And this is Caliban's reason. And all we know about this reason is that it is envious, that it is destructive, that this is what justifies our constraint of addressing these issues. I mean, I'm being philosophical here, but it's a high time, I think.
Thank you very much for that. I'm now going to ask Hugh and then Merilyn to say a few words in conclusion. You're the speakers, you get the right to have the summing up and say what you like. So Hugh first.
Well, it's very difficult to sum up. Of course, now that Caliban has been mentioned, I want to speak to the way in which in the early 17th century Shakespeare is alive to the terrible injustice that's being done to Caliban. 50 years before that, in Spain, there was a debate between two monks under the aegis of the crown to look at the injustices that were being done to the indigenous peoples of the Americas. So the history of protest, concern, anxiety runs as deep as imperialism itself. And I think that the line, to be silent is to be oppressed, is a crucial line. The breaking of the silence doesn't break the oppression, but it sure is a necessary step along the way. But I want to end on another more dismal note, and that is to say that the worst example in my working life of oppression of people and silencing of people is the boarding school program of North America and Australia in the 20th, principally in the 20th century. I have been alarmed and dismayed to discover when working in Botswana that the Botswana government has initiated a similar program of taking tribal children, San children, and putting them into boarding schools. I've discovered that in India, the whole boarding school program is expanding in order to break and silence tribal peoples in India. There's one school for indigenous children in India that has more than 20,000 pupils. These are projects absolutely of a piece with the old imperialist tradition of breaking those who are going to oppose. And we need to break the silence around all those projects. And all that I think I can do and urge everyone else to do is to listen to those who are speaking of what has happened to them and to challenge the silence that surrounds them all.
Thank you very much. Merilyn.
Okay. I want to step into the shoes of my parents and back into the shoes of my own life, and to say that we have to organize. We have to organize against the racists. You know, we have to organize against the state when it is racist, and of course, when it represses the working class and trade unions. And I mean, it's basically ideas grow out of organization. And, you know, and when Steve and I write about the resistance to the Nazis, what we're doing is we are looking at the records of people who did stand up. I mean, and standing up against tyranny, against repression can be a very, very difficult thing to do, because you can risk your life. And, you know, all honor to those who have resisted repression in the past, present, and in the future. Thank you.
Right. Well, thank you very much, both of you. That was a job well done. Much appreciated. So you get a virtual round of applause, I'm sure, from everybody, and it was much appreciated. The next meeting of the Socialist History Society will be at the end of October, and will be on the philosopher Lukács. So those of you who have spoken of philosophy this evening, we haven't actually set a date yet, but it will be. But I will circulate everybody with the details of that as soon as we've made the arrangements. And finally, I would ask you all who are not members of the Socialist History Society to consider joining. You get, for £30, you get 2 issues of the journal Socialist History, and you get 1 or 2 copies of 1 or 2 what we refer to as occasional publications. I rather shamelessly boasted about one that me and Merilyn had written earlier, a year, but I think more importantly, you become part of a movement of socialist history, and socialist history is about giving voice to the voiceless in many ways, about looking for about those who've not been heard in the past can be made to be heard, be they the enslaved, be they workers, be they victims of genocide, whatever. And that's a movement that we need to be part of. So thank you very much. Thanks again to our speakers, and see you again soon. Bye-bye.